Well, good morning, Stephen. Lovely to be with you again. And how are you today?
Absolutely, Philip. We're doing well. And yourself up there in Anglesey, how are you?
Yeah, we're doing well. We've got a bit of rain today, but you expect that up here. But no, we're doing well considering all the lockdowns. And it's lovely we can talk together. And today we're going to talk about Pesach, aren't we? Passover. And
Yes, that's right, Philip. I let slip the last time that it's my favourite festival.
yes,
I
yes,
do, I do like Pesach. It's partly the time of the year. It's spring. Spring
yes,
is beginning to take hold, and it's I think, a lovely festival in that its principal focus is in the home.
yes,
It's
yes.
quite unique, and I'm sure we will talk about that in some more detail.
Lovely. Well, it's lovely. Well, yes, we can talk about that, and that would be terrific if you can explain how the Jewish community celebrate Passover. But I think it's particularly valuable for Christian people as well to see where our roots come from. And maybe I can begin by reading a passage from Exodus, which I know you're very familiar with, Exodus chapter 12, which describes where the Passover was first instituted. I'll just read, I think, up to verse 14, where it says, Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire, with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. And thus you shall eat it, with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt. I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So this day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. I think it's so wonderful going back those thousands of years to Moses when the Israelites were about to pass through the Red Sea on the way to the Promised Land. And since then, uh, the Jewish people have commemorated this wonderful feast. And I remember reading recently through the book of Chronicles and seeing when there had been some lapses, and then there'll be a good king like Hezekiah would get it going again and invite the Jewish people from all over to come and celebrate that. So it's wonderful to have you with us and to explain. I showed you earlier this Seder plate. Hopefully people can see it, but I know you're very familiar with that. So Stephen, would you like to explain how you understand Passover and how the Jewish people commemorate it today?
Sure. So what you were reading, Philip, was on the night of the original Passover. This is where, and
Yes,
it's important to set it in the context, which I'm sure
exactly.
you're very familiar with, of slavery in Egypt, of a
Yes,
very bitter oppression, even to we know that the male children were being killed under this very oppressive Egyptian rule. And the children of Israel cry out in their anguish and their pain, and God hears them in their very deep
yes,
degradation as a slave people. And as the Torah puts it, remembers his pledge to the patriarchs. So that's the context of then what happens in terms of Moses being raised up as a leader, interceding with Pharaoh, Pharaoh refusing to comply with the requirement that the children of Israel should be allowed to go to worship the Lord, and then plague follows plague. So it's a very dramatic story. It's certainly keeps your attention, and then it culminates as you read on the Passover night. The significance, I think, of the lamb is that, as I understand it, it was an Egyptian god, so it was revered in Egypt, and therefore for the slave people to take the lamb and slaughter and eat it was a defiance of what they had lived under in Egypt, where the sheep was considered of more importance than the slaves. So that was a very significant aspect of it. And then the story unfolds with as we know, the slaughter of the firstborn of Egypt, the most horrendous of the plagues. Pharaoh is at last relents and lets the people go, but only, I think, out of desperation and fear.
He was a very stubborn king, wasn't he?
Yes,
he
absolutely.
Had all the other plagues and
yeah, it's plague after plague, but had no impact. And I think it's quite interesting, Philip, when you think about the impact of miracles.
Yes.
Because Pharaoh quickly regrets his decision to let the children of Israel go. So even having experienced the 10th plague and all that went before it, he's still not convinced of Almighty God and believes his power and his chariots and his strike force, which was probably the major military force in the ancient world, that was more important than God, even though he had experienced plague after plague. And having let the children of Israel go, he regrets it, gets his army together and wants to massacre them by the sea. So these miracles don't seem to have a huge impact. And even amongst the children of Israel themselves, who've experienced this themselves, and then the sea splits open as they cross the sea, very shortly they're rebelling and even thinking, well, perhaps life wasn't so bad in Egypt after all, when they're sitting there in the desert, which is a very harsh environment, and concerned about where the water is going to continue to come from and what happens if the manna doesn't keep falling from heaven. So even the children of Israel who benefited from these miracles, it doesn't seem to have a huge impact on them either. But leaving that aside, that's just my observation. But the kind of the celebration of Passover, as you say, this is something which is not just centuries old; it's millennia old. And the principal way that it's celebrated, and why I think many Jewish people would agree with me and say, yes, it's my favorite festival, is that it revolves around this celebratory meal in our homes with our families. Interestingly, in my tradition, which is kind of the Ashkenazi, the kind of European Jewish tradition, we don't eat lamb on Passover. That was the first night, and that would have happened in biblical times. But on account of the loss of the temple, we've made a decision, a break from the way that it is talked about in the Bible, and we remember the lamb. So on that plate that you showed us, we have a shank bone, and we point to it, and we certainly notice it.
The shank bone.
yeah, and that's to remind.
That's the shank bone. Yeah.
Yeah, that one there. Yes, indeed.
Okay.
So that's to remind us of the lamb. But in our tradition, we would not eat lamb on Passover.
Mm.
But it's a meal which is kind of so symbolic in terms of the foods we eat. The service is called the Haggadah, which is relatively short, but is a springboard for questions and questioning. And we encourage particularly our children to question as we go through the Seder, as it's called. That's the meal. And there's certain things about the Seder which is there to excite the children, their curiosity. We do things a little bit differently, where we're told to sit, we lean, because we're free men, we're not slaves anymore. We recline the way that I should imagine the Romans did in their banquet. So we're all free men. You know, we're eating, you mentioned the unleavened bread, the matzah.
Matzah, yeah.
Which today many people in the shops are familiar with, because it's not just in Passover, but around the year round. You can buy it in many supermarkets. It's actually become a bit of a health fad amongst people. They want to eat unleavened bread. That's part of the Seder night. It reminds us both of the affliction of slavery, because it was considered in Egypt to be poor man's bread. In other words, they couldn't afford to eat loaves, so slaves had matzah. But it also points to our freedom, because the story is that the children of Israel, as you read, they had to leave in a hurry with their staff in their hand and the sandals on their shoes, and to leave quickly. So they didn't have time to bake bread as they left. They ate unleavened bread. So in commemoration of that, throughout the festival, we don't eat normal bread, the challah, that loaf that many people might be familiar with. That doesn't feature in this festival. It's the matzah that we eat. So that's another aspect of the meal which kind of excites the curiosity of the children. They'll ask the question, why are we eating matzah? And that's a springboard to talk about the historic exodus of Egypt. But also in many families that will lead to conversations perhaps about more recent experiences that the family may have gone through. My wife's family is from Iraq. So in the family Seder, in that family, they would talk about having to leave Iraq. So the story is not just a historic one, it's something that recurs in Jewish history and the lives of many families, in terms of perhaps having refugee parents or grandparents or whatever it is. So that could be discussed as well. So it can't be very long. The Seder night can be into the early hours of the morning, how keen and energetic everyone is. So the service itself is quite short. We recite psalms and we retell the story of the Exodus, and that's as I've said, the springboard to much wider conversations and engagement. In normal years, Philip, it would be the extended family. So we invite the different generations coming together, and indeed guests as well. You would want to ensure that no one was alone on Seder night. In the synagogue I belong to, we would be encouraged to have guests, so that nobody should be alone. Of course, this year, as of last year, we are instead celebrating in our household as it was in the original Passover night.
Yes.
Household celebrating itself. So it's very colourful. It's something that Jewish people, even if they're not synagogue goers, even if they're not particularly observant, that they want to keep the Seder, because it reminds people of their childhood. I mean, I think there's an element, many people in the Christian world might talk about Christmas dinners in the same respect.
Yeah.
How your parents celebrated it, how the traditions that you grew up in as a family. So that there's that family element to it, which I think makes it so rich. And I think that's the secret of the Passover, why it survived even in a secular world where so much else is cast aside. you'll find even secular Jews will want to spend Passover night with families.
You mentioned that there are particular psalms. Are there specific psalms that would be read at Passover?
Yes, indeed. So it's psalms that are read on festive days. So there's a collection of psalms. We call them Hallel, which means praise.
Praise, yeah.
And so it's a series of psalms which would be read every Seder night and as part of synagogue services as well, sung to family tunes.
Yeah. So would you sing those psalms that they'll be sung?
So yes, it depends family to family, and as I've said, how energetic people are feeling, because it's interesting. The psalms are recited both before and after the meal.
Yeah.
So yes, different families will perhaps, some will recite, some will sing. So it's very kind of very family oriented. Each family will have their own traditions.
Would you sing them in Hebrew or in English or either?
So in our particular Seder, we will recite it in Hebrew. We make a point of translating it. Our knowledge of Hebrew is requires that. We wouldn't understand necessarily all the nuances if we just recite it in Hebrew. So it's not a long service, so we would be able to say it in Hebrew and then to translate and then to question. So that would be I think a fairly typical Seder night in many films.
Would you have? Are the cups of? Do you have cups of wine? Are they?
Yes, that's very much part of it. So we have four cups of redemption. So different terms of redemption. Each of them celebrated by its own cup of wine. I hate to add, you can drink grape juice. It's not a requirement to drink alcohol, particularly if you don't drink so much during the year. To have glasses of wine could send some people under the table. That's not. So and then there's a fifth cup, which is an interesting one, which we call the cup of Elijah.
Oh yes.
So this is the idea of looking ahead to a future redemption. Of which both in the Jewish and Christian tradition, Elijah is the herald of the so he has his cup and he goes around house to house. So how he manages drinking that amount of wine, I don't know, but he will have a designated cup. And again, it excites the children. The door is opened after the meal, and Elijah is invited to come.
Yes, I think it's lovely how the children are involved, because I think that's a big challenge today, isn't it, to pass our faith on to the following generation. And I can see
very much so.
That's something that would involve them, and they would never forget being involved as young children. Must be quite exciting for them as well. But now there's something I can't quite remember it now, but there's something that's hidden that the children have to find.
Yes, so we break the matzah into two halves.
Yes.
And then half of it is removed and hidden, and the children search for it after the meal.
Yes.
Many families will have a prize for the child who.
Yes. Yeah.
And there can be grown-up children as well, Philip. Let's be honest about it.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh yeah.
So so that is called the afikomen, the one and that is how we finish the meal. It's like a final dessert.
Yeah.
Before we will recite grace after meals, and then the final psalms that I've mentioned.
What wonderful. Yeah. So just in case we've forgotten any of these, we've got the egg, the parsley, we've got lettuce and haroset. You've mentioned about the lamb shankbone and the bitter herbs to remind
of the bitterness of slavery. That's fairly obvious, that one.
What about the egg?
Well, eggs it's interesting, isn't it? Because that's a very shared cultural phenomenon at this time of year, isn't it? The Easter egg.
Yes.
I think There's a burnt egg actually put on the table, which I think is a reminder of even perhaps the destruction of the temple, which is something that we always are to carry with us, even in our most joyful moments.
Yeah.
But we'll eat an egg, which is to sustain us during the early part of the Seder.
Yeah.
I think really the egg is a sign of renewal.
I think so. I think that's true in the Christian faith, isn't it? People might have different understandings. I think lots of children today might not know anything about why an Easter egg, but I think it's the thought of new life, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's kind of the shape of it shows a kind of renewal going through, and spring. It actually commands us in the Torah that this is a spring festival. It's tied to this time of year, and I think that's the reason for the egg. Now, you mentioned also the charoset.
Yes.
Which is an unfamiliar word to most people, I'm sure, but it's a combination of nuts and wine. And again, the kind of the traditional explanation, it reminds us of the cement. If you remember the story, they were making bricks. So there's that element of remembrance. But I think again, it's unusual. It excites the children's attention. There's a bit of wine in it. So we eat that prior to the meal itself.
Lovely, yeah. And I think the Bible is full of practical imagery, really, isn't it? But particularly with children, but for everyone, it helps. I think if you're teaching something, there's no better way than actually demonstrating it and showing something that will help remember.
Absolutely, that is very true. And the Torah again and again talks about, and you shall teach your children and your children. So this is all about, as you've referred to it, Philip, passing it down through the generations. And this is the method. The method is, as you say, visual, text. It's an experience. So we tend to, in the kind of Western world, to think of, well, religion, it's going to church or it's going to synagogue. But this is bringing it into the home, into eating, into our senses. And we are commanded to say that we must consider ourselves as if we were that generation, the generation that you read about, who experienced the plagues all around them, who were commanded to slaughter the god of Egypt and eat it. And we have to believe that we were slaves and that we are being liberated. So it's an experience.
Exactly.
I think if it becomes a ritual, it has to be experiential, and that is the way to pass it on, as the Torah says, to your children. That's really the inner core of the celebration of Passover.
Yes, and of course, in the passage I read, it was a new beginning, wasn't it? Because it said this month shall be the beginning of months. So it was obviously leaving slavery and entering into a new life with God, into an adventure, really, wasn't it? Go through the wilderness all those years and eventually
to get to Mount Sinai and to receive the Torah, the trials and tribulations of that generation in the desert. It is an amazing thing to read, and the fact that we're reenacting it. The Passover is something quite special. All Jewish festivals, there's always a food aspect to it, and in this one, it's not just the meal itself, because I've mentioned we don't eat bread. And further, the Torah tells us to rid ourselves of what it calls chametz, which is like a leaven.
Leaven, yeast,
so things that make things rise. So an obvious example of that are cakes during Passover, special Passover cakes. They wouldn't use flour because that's a agent. They'll use very often potato flour, which is well, if you've ever been to Israel during Passover, and many Christians do go there at that time of year because of Easter and wanting to be in Jerusalem, you'll know that it's a bit of an acquired taste, some of these cakes and things, and if you're eating matzah, as we do for 8 days, just on the Seder nights, but throughout the festival, it creates a different culinary experience through the week. And there's a lot of preparation going into that. So we're in the week leading up to Passover now. In many Jewish houses, the cleaning has begun. So getting rid of the stuff that we're not going to eat over Passover, having to buy in the stuff that we will be eating during the festival is quite an operation, and it's quite a lot of hard work.
Yes, lovely.
But
amazing. Yeah, well, I think, yeah, thank you so much, Stephen, because as I say, I think it's very informative for the Christian community to see how Passover is still celebrated, and see, because it's part of our biblical history, and I think I've mentioned before, I think many Christians don't realize when they have a communion service, its roots go back to the Passover, and so it makes it so much more meaningful. And well, thank you so much. It's been so. What's the next feast coming up?
So we're on, as soon as Passover, the Seder nights are finished, we're on the countdown.
Yeah.
Countdown to Shavuot, which is the Pentecost.
The Pentecost, yes.
And which comes, the 50. So we're counting 7 whole weeks.
Yes, it's sort of end of May, beginning of June time, isn't it?
And that, in the Jewish tradition, of course, is tied to the giving of the law at Mount Sinai in rabbinic Jewish tradition. And of course, Pentecost again has this Christian resonance.
Exactly, yeah.
Very much significant to you. So I wish you and your community and family blessed Easter and Passover. Please, God, a healthy, safe.
And yourself, yes.
For us all. And thank you for the platform, Philip. And it's lovely to keep in contact with you and whoever's watching. I appreciate it.
And we wish the same for yourselves and all the Jewish community. Thank you very much.